Carrie Coon stars in the second season of The Gilded Age on HBO. I'm David Buchanan with Gold Derby. Carrie, this season is so rich for your character. There's so much going on for Bertha, so many different arcs and intersecting plots. When you saw those scripts and you talked to Julian Fellows about the arc of the season, what were you most excited to sink your teeth into?
Oh gosh. Well, Laura Benanti and she was in my first television job ever, which was a guest star spot on the Playboy Club. And she was so lovely to me back then. She was the lead on that show, and I was doing a guest star arc. And I was so delighted when they cast her and that we would get to do that sort of catty back and forth. I mean, I regretted calling her old all the time. She looks much younger than me, but 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 I was just so excited she was going to join us for an arc. But of course, all of it. It's theater camp. It's all fun.
Okay, let's jump into that and then backtrack because I want to ask you about that scene with Mrs. Blaine. Like you said, it's so catty, it's so fun, but everything, I think what's so great about your portrayal of Bertha, and we'll dive into it, is everything is done rather politely. Her barbs are, veiled in very pleasant, a lot of pleasantry. But how fun was it to just do that scene? And those delicious, words, just so much fun.
It was a great speech. They had me starting at that rainy window, very dramatic. What I love about Bertha is that she is actually telling the truth. She's telling the truth. Nothing she says to Mrs. Blaine is entirely wrong. It's just things people don't normally say. And I so appreciate Bertha's ability to cut through all the BS and say what everyone is thinking. And of course, yes, with that level of reservation, because to display any kind of outward emotion is very uncouth in that time period. And that's why we only see Bertha do that at home with George in the library.
Yeah, another great scene that we have to dive into. But Bertha, I feel like she finally got a great win at the end of season one.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like she's, changed a lot as a character now that she has some more social capital than she did.
Mm-hmm.
She's now, punching, maybe above her weight or equal with her weight. But I wanted to ask you, how do you feel like Bertha has changed between season 1 and 2? And have you approached playing her differently now that you've gotten to live in her skin and in those outfits for an entire another season?
That's a good question. I think in the first season, we really felt her desperation. And so that was the overarching theme for the year for her. And as you point out, she has more confidence, she has more social standing. And so she's able to sit back a little bit more and take in the circumstances and be more calculating. And I also think more vulnerable. I've said it before, but I also believe that at heart, Bertha believes that she's in a meritocracy. She believes that people will earn their way to the top if they deserve it. Now, we know that the system does not operate that way, maybe for rich white people, but that's not how it's operating for the rest of the world. But for Bertha, that feels absolutely true. And I love that they gave her a nemesis who, in Turner, deliciously played by Kelly Curran, that is, who has really good taste. That Turner has really excellent taste. And so they have they're warring at such a sophisticated level, even though they're unhinged and private.
I love that scene at the end of episode 2, I think, where it's revealed that Mrs. Winterton is Turner, and you play it so perfectly. Like, did you know you wanted to play it that subtly?
David, no, David, there is a take that exists in the world that is an 11. And by level 11, I mean, I think I inhaled, staggered, caught George's arm and half fainted. I mean, and then when it was finished, Morgan turned to me and was like, wow. So sometimes we go big and then we bring it back down. So no, I just tried a bunch of things because, like we were talking about, there's a fine balance, right? There aren't supposed to be big explosions in public. That's a really big choice to make in that time period. It's considered very low class. And so I think that is ultimately the right choice. The way that scene is played is correct. But boy, did we throw some things at it that were a lot of fun.
This is why we need the DVD releases, physical media, folks, because we would love to see all the alts.
Yes.
I'd love to see what an 11 of that scene looks like. It's so delightful as it is.
We often go 11, especially at 3 in the morning at the tennis club in Newport. It gets a little crazy in a dress you can't actually walk or stand in.
Turner comes back in this Opera Wars plot, which is the overarching, it ties all the characters or mostly all the characters together this season. I know you're a huge film buff personally. I know
Yes.
you're a theater buff, all your work on stage. How much did you know and, love the opera prior to this? And was there
Oh.
anything that you learned through the season about opera that you were surprised by?
That's a great question. I have not been to much opera. As I've said before, I didn't grow up around a lot of theater, or I didn't get taken to the theater when I was a child, unlike a lot of these East Coast babies. And so I came to opera very late. I went to the Chicago Opera when I was in the city. Maybe one time I was invited to come along. And of course, we had a Gilded Age event at the opera this year, which was interrupted by climate activists, which I think probably more of that, please. And so I knew very little about it. And what was, I think, most shocking to me about the Gilded Age opera, well, A, that the opera war existed, that was an actual social war. And of course, the Met exists and the Academy doesn't. We know why. That really played out kind of similar to the way we depicted it in the show. And also just, I mean, it was just such a social, and it is still, but people actually go to the opera now and pay attention. And back then, it just felt like it was a big party, and I can't imagine being a performer during that time period. I think it would be infuriating. They're just all like waving and, changing boxes and just peacocking around, and just be miserable as an artist, I think.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. And speaking of theater artists, this arc has now brought you even tighter into the circle of Ward McAllister and Mrs. Astor, and you get so many scenes with Donna Murphy and Nathan Lane, who
Yeah.
are just so. I mean, they're delightful in real life, and they're delightful as these characters. And
Mhm.
again, it's such a great kind of balance of you're friendly with both of them. You're kind of there's a rivalry. You have that great line later in the season that friends and rivals are not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
Just talk about working with the two of them on really deepening these relationships because they're complicated, they're fun. There's so much going on in that kind of trio.
Yes. It's interesting. Whenever I get those scenes with Donna, there's always more going on than the first time you read it. And sometimes it takes Michael Angler or Julian to unpack some of the what would be a slight, what would be an insult, things that wouldn't necessarily read to a contemporary audience or to me on my first read through. So it's always good to have those experts around. But Donna, I mean, Donna's the perfect Mrs. Astor. And I love that they're all opportunists and they all know that. And so there's always this sort of surface service. Now she never really goes there with Mrs. Astor. But what's fun about the Ward McAllister scenes is that they just talk, they just say exactly what's going on, And we're like, well, we'll see what happens. And always leave the scenes, like cackling maliciously with each other. But I love that the heat's on Nathan this year and that Donna just embodies that. I mean, she's one of the grand dames of the American theater. And so she gets to just live inside of that persona with such ease and such regal ease that it's just always fun to play those scenes with her. It's delicious. It really is fun.
And they're so fun to watch. A scene that was not fun to watch because it was really, I think, hard for fans of George and Bertha is that scene you mentioned earlier where you have to confront him about what happened with Turner. There's been, innuendo about this. I thought that was one of the best scenes for you in the entire show so far. It's one of my favorite scenes of the season. And just because, we never get to see Bertha that unguarded, really. It's a rare occurrence.
Yeah.
What were the kind of discussions about how, again, a similar question to before, but how big to play that? Because, there are many other versions probably where, you're playing it more reserved. And this was just right in terms of showing how devastating a betrayal this was to Bertha.
One of the things I love about it is that the fight is not about whether or not George did anything. She believes that George didn't. She knows that he's loyal to her. It is the withholding of that information because they operate at full disclosure in order to continue their parallel tracks in the social and business worlds, right? They're very much working together. They're both very ambitious. There's a lot of mutual respect, which is the sexy thing about the marriage. And so I love that the crux of the fight, which Julian wrote, was not about a physical encounter. And then as far as the size of it, I mean, sometimes in period pieces, we forget that they're people. They're just people. Their clothes are tight, but they're just people with, big feelings. And I do, any opportunity we have to see Bertha vulnerable like that, I think it always deepens the character. And because we have less exposition this year, we had a few more moments of that. You know, the relationships getting more sophisticated, and also the fact that it gave George and Bertha something they had to get back to. And we got to enjoy their foreplay, which has to do with, you know, finding out where the Duke is dining and what ship he's on. And that's how they, you know, earn their way back together, as, you know, George has to kind of earn her trust again by participating in her schemes. And I think that's fun foreplay. I think it's a really hilarious dynamic in their relationship. So it was fun to kind of claw our way back to each other, as painful as it was for fans.
Yeah, such a rewarding scene and season for them too, because I feel like, you know, we'll see in season 3 the ending of the season for George and Bertha. I don't know how pleased he is about what's going on with Gladys, but we'll get there. I do want to ask you about Bertha's relationship to her children, because that's really deep in this season too. I mean, that scene you have with Larry, where Bertha confronts him about his relationship with Mrs. Blaine. I just wanted to ask you, like, how much is that maternal instinct of, you know, he's making a bad choice, like, don't do this, but how much is also Bertha's just self-preservation? Like, I cannot have this, you know, going on right now at this time in my kind of social climb.
Right. Yeah, timing is everything for Bertha, isn't it? I think it is very much both things. Obviously, Bertha knows that the world is set up for her son's success. And there's very little he could do to jeopardize that, given all of the you know, the circumstances he's operating inside of. And so one thing he could do is be with a divorcee. That's one thing that could scuttle the whole business for him, ruin his possibilities for marriage, his social standing, and also just his future happiness, the way she perceives what that happiness looks like. And of course, Bertha, when she thinks about her children, she thinks about her version of her children, not the children that are actually in front of her. So the same mistake she makes with Gladys all the time, she makes with Larry too. She's not wrong. She's not wrong about the consequences. Again, Bertha does tell the truth, and you have to give her a little credit for that. But she also doesn't let people make choices. She meddles, right? She meddles with Mrs. Blaine and makes sure that that falls apart. So she couches it as being about Larry's happiness, but we all know it's also, you know, mostly about where Bertha is, the fragility of her standing socially. Absolutely. And, you know, Larry gets a little of the Gladys treatment, and the world's not set up for Gladys. And so Bertha has to operate with a lot more, with more calculation there. And she doesn't trust Gladys with her own future. She doesn't believe Gladys is ambitious enough for herself, because she's not Bertha. And Louisa is much more, you know, when she's much more Bertha's daughter. Like, the way she conducts herself in the world is a way that Bertha really respects. And I think that's hard for her to see that she got the wrong daughter. You know?
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about where the season ends for Larry and Marion, because like, as you're saying, we know Bertha likes Marion. She's invited her into her home. She's invited her to the Met. How do you think she's going to respond to this potential pairing in season 3?
It's interesting. I mean, it does marry her family with an old money family, but also one that's was for briefly in perilous standing financially. But Bertha doesn't have to worry about the finances so much as the pedigree. So I find, if I were the writer on the show, I actually would find her to be quite supportive of this match for those very reasons. She really likes Marion. It would force Agnes to her knees. They would be family, which I think would be an interesting dynamic. And so I don't know. I think it's an interesting choice. When push comes to shove, I think actually she finds Marion's pluckiness, and especially Marion's willingness to violate the social rules, which is something Bertha believes that the stupid rules should be broken. And so she respects anyone who's willing to do that. So I don't know, it could be really interesting. Now, but as far as the obstacles next year, we know that George has expressed his support to Gladys to make a marriage, a pairing that has to do with love. And I'm afraid that Bertha's main obstacle may be coming from inside the house this year. We'll see.
Yeah, that's a huge momentous kind of end to the season at the opera. And I just have to ask you too, this show is so impeccably designed. Talk about like going into that opera house. You know, I know that was a kind of an amalgam of all these different locations to make a, you know, beautiful looking opera house. But what was it like to kind of go out into that box and imagine Bertha seeing a full theater at the Met? I mean, is that like, is it relief? Is it triumph? Is it all of the above?
Oh, yes. I mean, I can't imagine. There's nothing in my life I've experienced that would resemble that moment that she has. I mean, she absolutely wins the battle in the biggest city, in the most important city in the world. And she is the queen of the night. And that is just not something I come naturally to. But I do, but that's what makes it so fun to play those moments, which are so far from me. And it is an act of imagination, but boy, they built that. I mean, we had a 3-story opera box inside of our stage. It was wild to be sitting up there. And just to be able to look across and see, you know, to see Turner sitting. I love that moment in the box where her husband's chastising her and just Bertha saying, oh, I just love the look on her face, you know. What a wonderful moment that is. And also that they have the grace note of Celia Keenan Bolger and Doug down in the audience. That sort of small act of generosity we see Bertha endeavor this year. And just that acknowledgement, I think, is quite a lovely way of tying those worlds together, just the tiniest bit on that evening. That was a fun detail that I liked.
It was lovely. And you're mentioning all these incredible folks that you get to share the screen with. And the cast got a Screen Actors Guild Award ensemble nomination this year, which was so delightful to see. I mean, how meaningful was that for you and for the company?
Well, it was the first real validation we had that people were watching the show, that our peers were watching the show. You know, there's so much on right now. Oh, there's so many shows. It's impossible to keep up. If you want to be a responsible voter, there aren't enough hours in the day to be a truly responsible Emmy voter. It's really hard. And so when you find out that your peers are paying attention to your work, it's very gratifying. And I think everybody knows how hard it is in the theater right now. If anybody who has any relationship to the theater knows that the theater is really struggling. And so it was extra meaningful, I think, for them to uplift a show that's giving people jobs. People who are always grateful to have jobs. And that is the overarching feeling at work, is just one of overwhelming gratitude. And then also theater camp.
Before I let you go, Carrie, speaking of theater camp, there's so many people here that you don't always get to share the screen with as Bertha. So in season 3, if you could pick 1 or 2 folks who you would love to see Bertha interact with that you haven't really had the chance yet, who might they be?
Oh my gosh, that's so hard. I think there's no world where I really get to hang out with Danae, because I think Bertha just does not even see her. But I would love to get to act with her because she's delightful. I loved the newspaper room. I just thought that was a wonderful set and arc, and sexy too. And I always love the opportunity to interact with Cynthia and Christine, because we've actually had very little together, but it's always it always makes for really interesting, really complicated social dynamics when Agnes and Bertha are together, and just some great catty lines. It gives Christine a chance to unleash in her restrained and regal way. So that's always fun. I mean, it's really, you can't lose. You can't lose. It's just, you know, every day we have a really good time. We do. It's just really fun.
It is an extraordinary company. Carrie Coon, congratulations on the 2nd season of the Gilded Age. Thank you so much for talking to Derby.
Railroad Daddy! Continuing my one-woman Emmy campaign for Morgan Spector. Thank you. Thanks for
Pleasure.
the show. Appreciate it. I'll see you next time.